My name is Maria Santos, and for 30 years, I have been invisible. I have cleaned their marble floors, polished their crystal chandeliers, and served their elaborate dinner parties, while they talked about me as if I were a piece of furniture. Maria, bring more wine. Maria, clean up this mess. Never please, never thank you, just orders from people who believed they owned not just my time, but my very existence. The Whitmore family was old money, the kind that came from railroad fortunes and oil investments made generations ago. Their mansion in the hills of Connecticut was a monument to wealth that stretched back over a century. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch, was 92 when I started working for her. Her son Richard and his wife Patricia lived in the main house with their 3 children: Michael, the golden boy who could do no wrong; Jessica, the socialite, who married a senator; and Thomas, the youngest, who spent his trust fund on expensive cars and younger women. I came to work for them when I was 25, desperate and broken. My husband had just died in a construction accident, leaving me with nothing but grief and a mountain of medical bills. I had no family, no education beyond high school, and no prospects. When I knocked on the Whitmore's back door asking for work, I was prepared to beg. Mrs. Eleanor interviewed me herself, which the other staff said was unusual. She normally left such matters to the house manager, but there she was. This tiny woman with sharp blue eyes and silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, looking at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "What is your full name, dear?" she asked. "Maria Santos, ma'am." "Well, it used to be Maria Rodriguez before I married." Something flickered in her eyes, but it was gone so quickly I thought I'd imagined it. "And where are you from originally?" "I was born here, ma'am, but my parents came from Mexico. They died when I was young. Car accident." She nodded slowly. "I see, and you are willing to work hard. This is a demanding position." "Yes, ma'am, I'll do whatever you need." That was 30 years ago, 30 years of waking at 5 a.m. to prepare breakfast for a family who rarely acknowledged my existence. 30 years of cleaning up after their parties, their fights, their messes, both literal and metaphorical. 30 years of being treated like I was less than human. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, a woman with Mexican heritage, was cleaning the house of people who probably supported every anti-immigration policy that came up. I heard their dinner conversations, their casual racism, their complaints about those people taking jobs from real Americans. They never seemed to remember that I was one of those people, standing right there in the room with them. Mrs. Eleanor was different from the rest of her family, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. While Richard and Patricia treated me with cold indifference, and their children acted like I was invisible, Mrs. Eleanor always looked at me directly when she spoke. She remembered details about my life that surprised me. When I mentioned once that I liked to read, she started leaving books on my cleaning cart. When I caught a terrible flu one winter, she personally brought me soup, and made sure I had medicine. "You know, Maria," she said once, as I was dusting the photographs on her mantelpiece, "family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it is about who chooses to stay when everyone else leaves." I thought she was just being kind to an old employee, maybe feeling sentimental about mortality as elderly people often do. I had no idea she was telling me something far more profound. The distance between me and the family became more pronounced as the years went on. Richard and Patricia grew colder, more entitled. Their children, Michael, Jessica, and Thomas, grew up to be carbon copies of their parents, privileged, dismissive, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. They brought their own children around for holidays and family gatherings, and I watched a new generation learn to treat me like furniture. Michael became a lawyer specializing in corporate mergers, the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits and spoke only to people who could advance his career. Jessica married Senator Bradford and spent her time organizing charity galas where she could be photographed looking philanthropic, while actually helping no one. Thomas never found a career that satisfied him, preferring to live off his trust fund, while dabbling in various business ventures that invariably failed. Mrs. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew frailer but somehow more focused. In her final years, she spent long hours in her study, writing letters and making phone calls. Sometimes I would catch her staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, not quite sadness, not quite regret, but something that seemed to weigh heavily on her heart. "Maria," She said to me one afternoon, about 6 months before she died. Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if things had gone differently? I was changing the sheets on her bed, and I paused in my work. I try not to think about that, Mrs. Eleanor. It doesn't do any good to wonder about things you can't change. But sometimes we can change things, she said softly. Sometimes we get a chance to make things right, even after many years have passed. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, peacefully in her sleep. I was the one who found her, coming in with her morning tea, as I had every day for 3 decades. She looked serene, almost smiling, like she had finally completed some important task. The funeral was a grand affair, of course. The church was packed with senators, business leaders, and society figures, all of whom spoke about Mrs. Eleanor's generosity and grace. I sat in the very back, wearing my one black dress, watching as her family accepted condolences, and played the part of grieving relatives, but I had seen how they really felt about her death in the days leading up to the funeral. They were already planning how to divide her assets, already arguing about who would get the house, the artwork, the jewelry. They showed no genuine sorrow, only the kind of performative grief that wealthy families display in public while calculating their inheritance in private. The reading of the will was scheduled for the Friday, following the funeral family members only. The lawyer had specified. I was in the kitchen, preparing lunch for the gathering, when I heard raised voices coming from the library. What do you mean it is all gone to charity? Richard's voice was sharp with anger. Well, not all of it, came the measured voice of Mr. Pemberton, the family lawyer who had served the Whitmores for decades. There are specific bequests to family members, of course, but the majority of the estate. How much? Jessica's voice was shrill. How much did she leave to those bleeding heart causes? The charitable donations total approximately $40 million, Mr. Pemberton said calmly. The silence that followed was broken by Thomas's bitter laugh. $40 million to strangers while her own family gets table scraps. That is perfect, that is absolutely perfect. Now let's not be hasty, Mr. Pemberton continued. There are significant bequests to each of you, and of course someone will inherit the house and the remaining assets. Who? Patricia's voice was tight with tension. Who gets the house? Well, that is the unusual part of the will. Mrs. Eleanor has left the house, along with the remaining liquid assets and investments. 2. I moved closer to the door, not intentionally eavesdropping but unable to help overhearing as Mr. Pemberton continued, to Maria Elena Rodriguez Santos. The crash that followed sounded like someone had thrown a crystal glass against the wall. That is impossible, Richard shouted. She left our family home to the Maid. That cannot be legal, I assure you. The will is completely legal and binding, Mr. Pemberton said. Mrs. Eleanor was of sound mind when she made these provisions. She was quite specific about her wishes. But why? Jessica's voice was high and desperate. Why would she do this to us? We're her family. Perhaps, Mr. Pemberton said quietly. You should ask Mrs. Santos that question yourselves. There was another moment of silence before Patricia spoke, her voice dripping with venom. Where is she? Where is that woman? I realized they were about to come looking for me, and I quickly moved away from the door, my heart pounding. Mrs. Eleanor had left me everything. It seemed impossible. There had to be some mistake. Richard burst into the kitchen like a man possessed. Maria, get in here now. I followed him back to the library where the entire family was staring at me with expressions ranging from bewilderment to pure hatred. Mr. Pemberton, a distinguished man in his 70s, looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Mrs. Santos, he said gently, please have a seat. I remained standing. After 30 years of serving this family, sitting in their presence felt wrong, even in this moment. Mrs. Eleanor has left you a very substantial inheritance. Mr. Pemberton continued. The house, the contents, and approximately $15 million in liquid assets and investments. The number was so large it didn't feel real. $15 million. I made $30,000 a year. It would take me 500 years to earn that much money. This is insane, Michael finally exploded. She is nobody. She has been our maid for 30 years. What possible reason could grandmother have for this? Mr. Pemberton reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. Mrs. Eleanor left this letter specifically for Mrs. Santos, to be opened in the presence of the family. He handed me the envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of Mrs. Eleanor's personal stationery, covered in her elegant handwriting. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" Mr. Pemberton asked gently. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He cleared his throat and began to read. "My dear Maria Elena, if you are hearing this letter, then I am gone, and it is finally time for the truth to be told. I have carried this secret for 34 years, and I cannot take it with me to my grave. You are not just my employee, my dear, you are my granddaughter." The silence in the room was absolute. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. Mr. Pemberton continued reading. "Your mother was my daughter, Isabella. In 1962, when she was 19, she fell in love with a young man named Carlos Rodriguez. Carlos was kind, hardworking, and intelligent. But he was also Mexican-American at a time when my husband and I were blinded by our own prejudices and social expectations. When Isabella told us she wanted to marry Carlos, we forbade it. When she defied us and eloped with him anyway, we disowned her. We told everyone she had died in an accident, and we never spoke her name again in this house. It was the greatest mistake of my life. I hired private investigators to keep track of Isabella over the years, though I never contacted her directly. I was too proud, too stubborn, and too ashamed of what we had done. I watched from afar as she built a beautiful life with Carlos. I saw photographs of their wedding, their little apartment, their happiness despite having so little money, and then you were born. Maria Elena Rodriguez, born on the 15th of March, 1965. My first grandchild, though I had no right to claim you. When you were 5 years old, your parents died in that car accident. I wanted desperately to claim you then, to bring you home where you belonged, but Carlos's sister had already taken you in, and I told myself it was better to leave you with family who actually loved you rather than the grandmother who had rejected your mother. But I never stopped watching over you. I made sure money was anonymously donated to help with your education. I arranged for scholarships and opportunities, though you never knew where they came from. When you married young, I worried but hoped you had found the happiness your mother had found with your father, and then your husband died, and you came to my door looking for work. When you told me your name was Maria Rodriguez, and when I saw your face so much like your mother's face, I knew immediately who you were. You have Isabella's eyes, her smile, her graceful way of moving through the world. You have her strength, too. The strength that allowed her to choose love over money, principle over prejudice. I should have told you immediately. Instead, I was a coward. I told myself I would reveal the truth when the time was right. But months became years, and years became decades. I was selfish, Maria Elena. I wanted you near me, but I was afraid that if I told you who you really were, you would hate me for what we did to your mother. I was afraid you would leave, and I couldn't bear to lose you again. So I kept you as my employee, instead of embracing you as my granddaughter, and that is a sin I will never forgive myself for. But I watched you grow into an extraordinary woman despite the hardships you faced. You have more grace, more kindness, and more dignity than anyone else who has ever lived in this house. You are the true heir to the Whitmore name, not because of blood alone, but because you embody everything this family should have been and failed to become. You earned every dollar I am leaving you through 30 years of service, loyalty, and love that I was too blind to properly acknowledge. The others in this room will be angry. They will contest this will, though they will not succeed. They will claim you manipulated me, though you never asked me for anything beyond fair wages for honest work. They will say you don't deserve this inheritance, though you are the only one who truly does. But you, my dear granddaughter, must decide what to do with this truth. You owe these people nothing. You owe me nothing. You are free to take this inheritance and build whatever life makes you happy. If you choose to stay in this house, make it a home filled with the love and warmth it has lacked for far too long. If you choose to sell it and start fresh somewhere else, know that you carry with you the love of a grandmother who was too proud and too foolish to claim you in life, but who has loved you every single day for 30 years. Your mother Isabella would be so proud of the woman you have become. I only wish I had been brave enough to tell her that before she died. With all my love and deepest regrets, your grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore P.S. In my personal safe, behind the portrait of your mother in my bedroom, you will find more letters I wrote to you over the years but never sent. You will also find the only photographs I have of your parents, which I should have shared with you long ago. When Mr. Pemberton finished reading, the silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the eyes of everyone in the room staring at me, but I couldn't process what I had just heard. I was not Maria Santos, the maid. I was Maria Elena Rodriguez, granddaughter of Eleanor Whitmore. The woman I had served for 30 years was my grandmother. The house I had cleaned was my family home. The people who had treated me like dirt were my cousins, and my mother, the mother I barely remembered, had been disowned by this family for marrying the man she loved. Richard was the first to break the silence. This is impossible. This is some kind of scam. I assure you, it is not, Mr. Pemberton said firmly. Mrs. Eleanor provided extensive documentation: birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, private investigator reports spanning decades. Maria Elena Rodriguez is indeed Isabella Whitmore's daughter. But Jessica's voice was weak. But she has been our maid. Yes, I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time. I have been your maid. I have cooked your food, cleaned your messes, and served at your parties for 30 years, and in all that time, not one of you ever treated me like I was human. Thomas laughed. A bitter sound. So what? You are our cousin now. You think that changes anything? I looked at him, this man who was my blood relative, who had grown up in privilege, while I scrubbed floors to survive. No, I said. It doesn't change anything. You are exactly the same people you were 5 minutes ago, selfish, cruel, and empty. And I am exactly the same person I was 5 minutes ago. The only difference is that now I know why my grandmother left me everything. You can't do this, Patricia said, her voice rising to a screech. You can't just steal our inheritance. I am not stealing anything, I replied calmly. Your grandmother made her choice. She chose to leave her estate to someone who actually deserved it. We'll fight this, Richard threatened. We'll contest the will. We'll prove you manipulated her. You are welcome to try. Mr. Pemberton interjected. But I should inform you that Mrs. Eleanor anticipated this reaction. She had extensive psychological evaluations done in the months before her death, all confirming her mental competence. She also had video testimony recorded, explaining her decisions in detail, and she left very specific instructions about what should happen if any family member contests the will. What instructions? Michael demanded. Any family member who contests the will forfeits their individual inheritance entirely. Those funds would then be donated to additional charities. The fight went out of them all at once. They had their smaller inheritances, probably several $100,000 each, though that seemed like nothing compared to what I had just inherited. 30 years, I said, looking around the room at these people who shared my blood but had never shared their humanity with me. 30 years I worked in this house, and you treated me like I was invisible. You complained about immigrants at dinner tables where I served your food. You made jokes about the help. While I cleaned up your messes, you acted like I was so far beneath you that I didn't even deserve basic courtesy. My voice was steady, but I could feel emotion building behind it. And now you are angry because the woman you couldn't be bothered to really know turned out to be your family. You are upset because the grandmother you took for granted loved the granddaughter you ignored? I turned toward the door, then stopped. Mrs. Eleanor was right about one thing. Family isn't about blood, it is about who chooses to stay when everyone else leaves. You all left her, emotionally, years ago. You only came around when you needed money or when there were social obligations. I stayed. I took care of her. I was her family when you weren't. So what happens now? Jessica asked in a small voice. I considered the question. What did happen now? I owned this house, this massive monument to wealth and privilege. I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I could travel the world, buy anything I wanted, never work another day in my life. But more than that, I had answers. I had a family history. I had a mother's name and a father's love story. I had a grandmother who had loved me from afar for 30 years, too proud to claim me, but too devoted to let me go. Now, I said, you all leave. This is my house now, and you are no longer welcome in it. You can't just throw us out, Patricia protested. Actually, I can, Mr. Pemberton. These people are trespassing on my property. Please call the police if they don't leave voluntarily within the next 10 minutes. It was remarkable how quickly they moved when faced with actual consequences for their behavior. Within minutes, the four of them had gathered their personal belongings and stormed out, their anger and outrage trailing behind them like expensive perfume. Mr. Pemberton stayed behind to go over the legal details. There would be paperwork, transfers, accounts to set up. It would take weeks to finalize everything. Mrs. Santos, he said as he was preparing to leave, or rather, Miss Rodriguez, I should tell you that Mrs. Eleanor spoke about you often in her final years. She was very proud of you, and very sorry for the years you lost together. Did she ever consider telling me the truth while she was alive? He nodded. Many times she wrote you hundreds of letters over the years. She had me draw up documents several times to change your employment status, to legally adopt you as an adult, to make you a full family member, but she always pulled back at the last minute. She was terrified that you would reject her the way she had rejected your mother. That night, I sat alone in the mansion that was now my home. It felt strange to walk through these rooms as an owner rather than an employee. Everything looked different somehow, like I was seeing it all for the first time. I went upstairs to Mrs. Eleanor's bedroom, Faye, my grandmother's bedroom, Faye, and found the safe hidden behind the portrait. Inside were stacks of letters, all addressed to me, dating back 30 years. There were also photographs, dozens of them. My parents on their wedding day, both young and radiantly happy. My mother did look like me, or rather, I looked like her. My father was handsome in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. There were pictures of them in their small apartment, at family gatherings with his relatives, and several of them, with me as a baby and toddler. I read through the letters my grandmother had written, but never sent. They chronicled my life from her perspective, celebrating my small victories and agonizing over my struggles. She had known about every job I'd held before coming to work for her, every relationship, every hardship. She had watched me grow up from a distance, loving me in secret. In one letter, written on my 30th birthday, she had written, I watched you clean the house today, with the same grace and dignity you bring to everything. You are so much like your mother, but stronger somehow. You survived losses that would have broken a lesser person. I am proud to be your grandmother, even though I have no right to claim that title. Every day I see you as a gift I don't deserve. I cried reading those letters. I cried for the grandmother I had never known I had, for the mother I barely remembered, for the 30 years we had lived in the same house without being able to truly be family. But I also felt something else, peace. For the first time in my adult life, I knew who I was. I wasn't just Maria Santos, the maid with no family and no prospects. I was Maria Elena Rodriguez, daughter of Isabella Whitmore, and Carlos Rodriguez, granddaughter of Eleanor Whitmore. I came from love, even if that love had been complicated by pride and prejudice. The next morning, I called the other staff members, Faye the gardener, the part-time cook, the cleaning service that came twice a week. I gave them all significant raises, and told them their jobs were secure for as long as they wanted to keep working. Then I called a contractor and an interior designer. I was going to renovate this house, not to show off wealth, but to make it the kind of home my grandmother had wanted it to be. Warm, welcoming, filled with love and laughter. I also called a lawyer, Faye, not Mr. Pemberton, but someone who specialized in charitable foundations. I wanted to set up a scholarship fund for young women like I had been. Alone, struggling, trying to build a life after loss. They would never know where the money came from. Just like I had never known my grandmother was helping me all those years ago. Richard did try to contest the will, just as he had threatened. His lawsuit lasted exactly 3 weeks before his own lawyer convinced him to drop it. The evidence of my identity was overwhelming, and his chances of success were essentially zero. He lost his individual inheritance as a result, which was donated to immigrant rights organizations. The irony was not lost on me. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind my house, watching as workers installed a memorial fountain. It was dedicated to Isabella and Carlos Rodriguez, the young couple who had chosen love over money, and paid for that choice with their family. I had found my mother's sister, my Aunt Carmen, who was still alive and living in California. She cried when I called her, thinking I had died years ago when I disappeared from her life to get married. We had a tearful reunion, and she was able to tell me stories about my parents that filled in so many missing pieces. My mother had been spirited and independent. She told me, the kind of person who would rather be poor and happy than rich and miserable. My father had been quiet but steady, a man who worked with his hands, and loved with his whole heart. They had died knowing they had made the right choice in choosing each other over the Whitmore fortune. The house staff, who had once barely acknowledged me, now treated me with genuine respect and affection, not because I was wealthy, but because I treated them the way I had always wished to be treated, like human beings deserving of dignity and kindness. I never saw Richard, Patricia, Michael, Jessica, or Thomas again after that day in the library. I heard through Mr. Pemberton that they had all moved away, apparently unable to bear living in the same community where their former maid had become the wealthiest woman in town. Sometimes I wondered if they had learned anything from the experience. Did they ever examine their own behavior and recognize how cruel they had been? Did they ever consider that perhaps their grandmother had good reasons for her decision? Probably not. People like them rarely look inward when they can blame external forces instead. But I didn't waste much time thinking about them. I had a life to build, relationships to nurture, and a legacy to create. I traveled to Mexico to learn about my father's family history. I took Spanish lessons to connect with the language my parents had spoken together. I read everything I could find about my mother's generation, trying to understand the world she had lived in, and the courage it had taken to choose love over acceptance. I also started dating again, something I hadn't done since my husband died. I met a man named David, a teacher at the local high school who knew nothing about my wealth when we first met. He fell in love with Maria Elena, not with the Whitmore fortune, and that made all the difference. On the 1-year anniversary of my grandmother's death, I held a memorial service in the garden. I invited everyone whose life she had touched, not just the wealthy and powerful who had attended her funeral, but the scholarship recipients she had supported, the charities she had funded, the staff members she had treated with genuine respect. I spoke about the woman I had finally learned to call grandmother, about her regrets and her love, about the courage it took to make amends even from beyond the grave. I talked about the importance of choosing love over pride, acceptance over prejudice, and kindness over status. That evening, as the last guests were leaving, I sat by the fountain dedicated to my parents, and opened the final letter my grandmother had left for me. This one was marked to be opened 1 year after my death. In it, she wrote, "My dear Maria Elena, if you are reading this, then you have had a full year to process the truth about our family and to decide what kind of life you want to build. I hope you have found happiness, I hope you have found peace, but most of all, I hope you have found forgiveness, not just for me, but for all the years we lost, for all the words left unspoken, for all the love that went unexpressed. You see, my dear granddaughter, the greatest inheritance I can leave you is not money or property, it is the knowledge that you are loved, that you have always been loved, and that you deserve every good thing life has to offer. Your mother broke our family's cycle of prejudice and pride when she chose your father. You have the chance now to complete what she started. Use this wealth not just to build a life for yourself but to build a better world for others. Be the change our family needed, but was too afraid to embrace. And remember always that the best way to honor those who loved us is to love others with the same fierce, uncompromising devotion. You are my pride and my redemption, Maria Elena. Live boldly, love deeply, and never ever let anyone make you feel invisible again. All my love, always. Your grandmother." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket, next to my heart. Around me, the garden was peaceful in the moonlight, the fountain bubbling softly as it honored my parents' memory. I thought about the young woman I had been 30 years ago, desperate and alone, knocking on the back door of this mansion looking for work. She could never have imagined this moment, this life, this transformation. But perhaps that young woman had been stronger than she knew. Perhaps she had been preparing for this all along, learning lessons in humility and service and grace that would serve her well when the time came to claim her true inheritance. I wasn't invisible anymore, I never would be again. I was Maria Elena Rodriguez Whitmore, and I was finally home.